Welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, February 5th, 2024. Forgive my voice here today. I am a little bit under the weather, but I wanted to make this video for you guys because my election prediction has changed from the last time I made one on December 15th, 2023. Now, if you're new to the channel, I make these videos every month or around every month that update the status of the election as we get closer and closer to November. And now, interestingly enough, this election cycle has been relatively boring. A lot of the moments that we've seen the polls fluctuate and change really happened around a year ago, 6 months ago, but since then we've seen a pretty steady and consistent lead for former President Donald Trump. But despite that, we know what happened in 2022 and 2020 and 2018 and even 2016 can inform how we address this race and what the prediction might be for this upcoming presidential. And with that, we will kick it off in the start of characterizing all of our safe states for either side of the aisle. So we begin with the Democratic states. These are states that are never going to go to the GOP regardless of what's happening nationwide, at least for this election cycle. These are states that are very solid in the Democratic Party side, and Republicans, of course, have their own too. But generally speaking, these are the states where you really don't see much movement and haven't seen much movement over the past 20 years. Every single state I've characterized as a blue state on this map thus far voted for the Democratic Party in every election since the 21st century began, and will likely continue to do so for many decades to come. As we continue moving around this map here, you will see that the election really does boil down to just a very few individual states that do determine the overall partisan composition of the presidency, the White House, the Senate, the House, and states that just generally are competitive election year after election year that often get the most focus. And so as we begin characterizing all of the safe red states, you might be interested to find out that some of these states weren't always safe red. Just as many of the safe states that are blue weren't always safe blue. A lot of the times you do see sort of a realignment across some of these states, but for whatever reason, it seems to have began in the year 2000, which is perfect for the saying in the 21st century, but has been pretty consistent throughout election cycle after election cycle. But we might see some movement in some of these safe red states sometime in the future. I'm not so confident about that on the Democratic side. So looking at these states, we're not done characterizing all of the safe ones just yet. We have Nebraska at large, Nebraska's first district. If you're interested into why Nebraska and Maine have these little boxes up here, it's because they do not actually allocate their electoral votes on a winner-take-all system. These are the only two states in the entire country that moves with a congressional district and statewide electoral vote count. So essentially, the statewide electoral count gets 2 electoral votes. So however the state goes, those 2 electoral votes will be won by a winner-take-all system, and then each congressional district can vote for either candidate. And so we actually saw back in 2020 that Nebraska's second congressional district voted for Joe Biden, and thus he won an electoral vote from that district. So it's very interesting. Same thing in the case in Maine. Donald Trump won the Maine second district, but overall the state went to President Biden. And so looking at this map, you might be wondering, okay, why are some of these states that I've historically known as safe Republican not characterized there yet? And that's solely because we are going to characterize them as what we call and determine to be likely red or likely blue states, where we generally know how these states are going to go. We can foresee it nearly a year in advance, but there is a slim reality in which these states do flip blue, or they maybe have shown us in recent elections that they have the possibility of getting very, very close, despite historically always being on one side of the aisle. Those are states like Texas, where Donald Trump will likely win the state, no pun intended, by a likely margin, anywhere between 5 and 15%. For context, back in 2020, he won the state by 5.6%. Then we move over to the state of Alaska, narrowing up a little bit more. It's not exactly, Trump plus 15, but somewhere around there, we might expect Donald Trump to win by at least 10 points in this state. The state of Florida has actually moved over more in favor of the GOP since the 2020 election quite significantly. Votes in favor of the Republican Party in my prediction here by a very strong margin. I think you're going to see Donald Trump get the margin of around a 7 to 8 point advantage over Joe Biden. And so Florida for right now, I think given the fact that we've seen significant movement amongst Latino voters in this state, significant movement amongst just general voters in the state, and also a dramatic influx of residents into the state of Florida from other states during the COVID-19 pandemic, you found that often they split, sometimes down 80 to 20 or 90 to 10 ideological split here in favor of the GOP. So massive migration within the country down to Florida, a lot of it benefiting the Republican Party. We saw it happen in 2022. Ron DeSantis won the state by 20. Marco Rubio won by 21. Overall, Florida is a pretty solid state for the GOP. I expect nothing less for President Trump. Now, moving over to the Joe Biden side, though, he also has likely blue states. These include states like Colorado and New Mexico and Virginia that, despite the fact that they might have historically been competitive or have shown the possibility of being a little bit narrower than we might expect in recent elections. New Mexico's Senate election in 2020 is a perfect example. The 2016 election in Colorado and Virginia are perfect examples, but recently have been pretty solid for the Democrats. So Biden won Virginia in 2020 by 10 points. I expect him to win by at least above 5 this time. We haven't seen that much shifting across the country. Colorado, new polls actually show him in the likely margin as well. I expect Joe Biden to win here by around 10 points. Democrats did phenomenally here back in 2022. New Mexico here, same thing for the Democrats in 22. Biden also won this state by double digits back in 2020. Again, not enough movement to take these states out of the likely blue column. Another state that I would characterize as likely blue is Maine at large. I think we've seen that this state here has narrowed up since the Obama era, but not enough to make it more competitive. Joe Biden's going to win the state 7, 8, 9 points like he did in the last election. I think it's going to hover around the same. New England, we really haven't seen much movement in terms of support nationwide. We've seen the national number shift. We've seen the statewide number shifts when it comes down to Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. But interestingly enough, New Hampshire and Maine, we've seen practically no shift against President Biden. And so right now you are seeing, and honestly it makes a lot of sense, these are two of the whitest states in the entire country, and some of the shifts that we've seen in terms of support and the wavering in support for President Biden has largely been coming not from white voters, because Democrats actually don't win white voters nationwide, minority voters. And when you see a lack of enthusiasm on that front, it matters in states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. When you have deep minority, majority pockets, I know that sounds like a tongue twister there, majority minority districts, majority minority counties here, Philadelphia region, Milwaukee region, Detroit region, that are pivotal to Democratic Party success up across these states. Lack of enthusiasm there really does make those a lot more competitive, a lot more in favor of voting for Trump than they were in the last election. In states where you actually do not see a high minority population, like New Hampshire, like Maine, again, no movement there. It brings me to my next characterization, the state of New Hampshire, moving it away from the lean blue column, now a likely blue state. Pretty consistently, we've seen data out of the state that shows Joe Biden in a very good point in this state. We have seen very little movement away from where President Trump and where President Biden were in the last election. I also will say here, a poor display of showing in New Hampshire in the New Hampshire primary is not good news for President Trump. You found that around 42% of Nikki Haley voters in Iowa and roughly half in New Hampshire said they would not vote for Donald Trump in the general election. That's not a good sign. Iowa, it's enough here that I think the bank could keep Donald Trump very much afloat. Maine and New Hampshire, I do not think that is the case. Now, Donald Trump also has some other likely states. I wanted to just take a pause before we went through all of them together, but I just talked about one of them. The state of Iowa is going to be a likely red state. President Barack Obama won this state twice. Hillary Clinton lost it by 9 points. Joe Biden lost it by 8 points. I do not think that Iowa has somehow gotten better for Democrats. In fact, I think we've seen an exodus of different population groups in states like Iowa, in the Rust Belt, in Ohio, moving down into the Sun Belt. You're seeing a migration again, not only in Florida, but in states like North Carolina and Georgia and Arizona and Texas. Large swaths of populations moving in from up across the United States. Iowa just so happens to be becoming more conservative because of it. So Iowa, I think Donald Trump wins by a likely red state. It also makes sense, too. You saw Kim Reynolds with a phenomenal margin here in 2022. Democrats obliterated across the state, arguably enough. And so Iowa, for right now, I would say, is a red state, voting for Donald Trump by around 7 points, 8 points, 9 points, maybe even 10, depending on how Donald Trump really does run up the margin as he is predicting he will. Ohio is another state that I think you are going to see Donald Trump do quite well there as well. You saw that J.D. Vance, despite being a lackluster, out fundraised, really, really poor candidate in the race, he won by 6 points. And so he ran against a Democrat who had represented a swing district, knew how to win in Ohio, just not in this climate, knew how to win the Ohio of 2012, or arguably even 2016 or 2018. But that's not the case of where Ohio is today. Ohio is a state that is pretty solidly conservative. Now, to put this into perspective, too, I think we also have to look back at 2018 when Richard Cordray was running against Mike DeWine. It was a very competitive governor's race. Richard Cordray was up by 3 points on election day in polls, and he lost by about 3. A 6-point swing, but it wasn't super significant. This time around, Governor Mike DeWine, being a Republican incumbent, was able to win in a landslide in this election by around 20 points across the state. Democrats did not even invest in the governor's race there because on the national front, they've very much given up Ohio as a red state, just as they have given up Iowa, just as they've now given up Florida even. And so you're seeing here that this is really where Donald Trump does shine because he visits these states. He focuses on these states, and they were crucial to his victory in 2016. And he certainly is not taking them for granted. I think what Democrats are doing here are prioritizing where they can and cannot win. I expect a large presence in Ohio. I do not expect a large presence in Iowa. That's not because Biden can win Ohio. It's because Sherrod Brown can. And so I think we will see Democrats invest solely and only for the Senate race in Ohio and then pull out just as they did in 2022 and arguably even, in 2020 and 2018 in some of these races. But generally speaking, you're going to see less and less Democratic involvement in Ohio as the years go on. So enough about those states. What is unique about the remaining states here is that all of them will be decided by a margin that is closer than what we've already characterized some of our states and battleground districts. Maine second actually goes to Trump by a likely margin. I think we're going to see nearly identical results in Maine and New Hampshire as we did in 2020. Moving back to where we are, Nevada, Arizona, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, and Nebraska's 2nd District. These 104 toss-up electoral votes truly do determine who wins the White House. And looking at them, there are clumps of regions, but they do sort of span all across the United States. You have states on the western part of the United States, Nevada in the Sun Belt region as well, Arizona. You also have Georgia and North Carolina, a unique sort of southern take on swing states. Then you have the Rust Belt region, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. And then you have that pocket of really middle America, Nebraska's 2nd District, the Omaha region here, that historically has been good for Biden, but only in one election. It was closer in 2016. Trump still won the district, but Republicans have actually gerrymandered the district a little bit more to make it more conservative, but chances are it'll still go blue. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And as we look at these states, we start to see a very, very similar map forming in terms of where President Biden and his re-election bid is spending the most money in the upcoming election cycle. All of the states and districts on this toss-up map right now are states that are being invested in significantly by the Biden campaign besides the state of Minnesota. You are seeing that all of these states will be seeing nearly $250 million spent across the 8 that will determine the balance of power in this country, determine who the next president of the United States will be, and that is on the Democratic side. Republicans have yet to announce the amount of money and energy they will be putting in to many of these states, but I can imagine it will match, if not exceed, what Democrats have already committed to these states. These will be the most important ones, and I think what we are going to find is that as they are the most important, they also find themselves to be the most close, at least across the country. Now, I do think that Donald Trump having won North Carolina back in 2020 does serve to his benefit this time around as well. I think Donald Trump has seen improvements in many of these battleground states since the last election cycle. The question is, how large are these improvements? I think he does win North Carolina, not only on the fact that he won it in the last election cycle, but Democrats really haven't had much luck in this state. It's very similar to the Republican parties, or Democratic parties in Nevada, where they have won consistently there, but not without close margins and not without, off-governor elections where you do see Republicans or Democrats do well. North Carolina has a Democratic governor and probably will elect another one this election cycle. Nevada has a Republican governor and will probably re-elect him in 2026. It's very interesting if you ask me, but North Carolina for right now is pretty solid in favor of the GOP. Just not enough to be a margin. That's by likely characterization, and I could actually see it flipping depending on how the remaining, months go leading into the general election. This also comes in with the state of Georgia that I do believe that Donald Trump is up today in this state. He just got over 50% in recent polls, and that's not a good sign for Democrats. I think Joe Biden has really started to see the bleeding amongst, minority groups, specifically Black Americans. You see it in Georgia. You see it in North Carolina. It's not that they're voting for Trump. It's just that they're not enthusiastic enough to vote in this election cycle, right? There is no, high level of enthusiasm as there was in the last election cycle, at least right now, and that could be a combination of factors. One, it could be the fact that the primary season isn't over. Right now, you still see a good chunk of Americans don't believe the matchup is going to be between Trump and Biden. On the second side of things, too, you also might find that they are disagreeing with the way President Biden is handling international relations, handling the war in the Middle East, what's happening in Gaza. Things around those lines, really, you could see a really big bleed effect across some of these minority groups. And another thing on the third side is the economy. While the economy is good in terms of raw numbers, that's not what the average American is feeling, thinking, or just overall perceiving the economy to be. That is a problem for the Biden campaign that they will have to tackle, and it also does result in decreased enthusiasm and consequentially decreased support. Moving over to another state where I really do think you are seeing a lot of bleeding is the state of Michigan. Now, this is a state in my last election prediction I had going for the Democrats. I no longer believe that Joe Biden will win the state of Michigan today. I do think it's possible, and that's why my characterization is down to a tilt margin. I think you are going to see here, though, especially in the Dearborn area, in the Detroit region, unavoidable effects here of the fact that you do see a heavy disagreement with the way that President Biden is tackling issues abroad. You will find it very much in Michigan. You will find it in North Carolina. You will find it in Georgia. In fact, you will find it in a lot of these states. Michigan, uniquely enough, is a state that Joe Biden won by the largest margin in 2020 across Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the state that Hillary Clinton lost the least by in 2016 across Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and yet now you are seeing Democrats actually doing not too hot in this state. One thing that I would just see as a caution here, if these numbers persist between now and September and October, Democrats should be scared because it means they're probably going to lose the state. But again, time will tell. The Biden campaign has time to build back up, but the Trump campaign really is hammering in on this state. They're planning a lot of visits across the country, and he also did win this state previously, which doesn't make it impossible for him to win it again. I think it's often here that we see a lot of people on the left forget that Donald Trump did in fact win these states in an election cycle before against Hillary Clinton. While she didn't necessarily treat these states as the swing states that they were in the election cycle, the polls might have predicted otherwise, the fundraising numbers predicted otherwise, yada, 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 whatever you want to explain the reason as to why it wasn't treated like a swing state. It absolutely was. When we saw Donald Trump break through that blue wall for the first time in nearly 3 decades, it really put things into perspective for Democrats here that these states can be won by Republicans, and I think that might have been lost, considering that Democrats have had solid victories here in 18, 20, and 22, but it absolutely can happen again, and they cannot take that for granted. So Michigan is the first official flip from my last video, and that actually brings Donald Trump up to 266 electoral votes. But it isn't all bad news for President Biden. I think he wins Minnesota by a lead margin. You're going to see maybe a reduction in terms of that 7-8 point margin that he had previously, but it's going to be, a state that Biden does quite well in. I think, again, you are seeing that bleeding amongst minority groups in Minnesota. New polls out of the state show it closer than it was in the last election cycle, and you don't really see that much movement amongst white voters, but you do see it amongst minority voters. When you look at young voters, too, it isn't just minority voters. It's the most reliable Democratic voters, minority voters and young voters, and yet you are seeing nationally even that Biden and Trump are sometimes within striking distance of each other. That should not be happening. You should be seeing 30-point margins amongst young voters. You're not seeing that because I think you're seeing a high level of disapproval and a high level of disengagement with this election cycle, with some polls even showing President Biden at just 40% amongst youth voters compared to 67%, 70% in the last election cycle. And so Minnesota still goes blue. I think he also still wins Nebraska's 2nd district again in the areas where you are seeing more of a, predominantly white population, regions of the country where you don't see minority, turnout being the only reason why Democrats do quite well in these states. I think you're going to see Nebraska's 2nd district go blue, Minnesota go blue, bringing President Biden up to 266 electoral votes. Like I also mentioned about the state of North Carolina, I know it might seem naive to think that Joe Biden can win Nevada despite these numbers nationwide, but I do believe it. I think the lean margin, the tilt margin here is a perfect capturing of the essence of what we will see for Democrats in this election cycle. 2022 should have gone to Adam Laxalt. You should have seen Republicans do arguably a lot better in the state of Nevada. They didn't, and I think there's a reason for that. I think you are going to see exactly what that reason is once we get closer to Election Day, but overall, these voters in Nevada, especially the Latino voters in Nevada, are not the same across the country. I think also you are seeing that a lot of people made the mistake in 2022 of treating Latino voters as a monolith, seeing mega or MAGA movements, whatever you want to say. I just thought that'd be funny. It's probably not, now that I'm saying it out loud. But, Florida, you're seeing, significant movements, that's a better word for it, amongst Latino voters in Florida, especially some in Texas amongst the Rio Grande Valley. You're seeing them across the southern border. But that's not where the majority of Latino voters are across the country. I think that's really where the analysis went wrong and why Nevada ultimately voted blue on the Senate level and why many people missed that. Because at the end of the day, Nevada is still at heart a blue state. And I think President Biden will tap into that and still be able to win here. Now, I know what you're thinking. Joe Biden's at 232. Isn't that where Donald Trump was in the last election cycle? Yes. Isn't that where Hillary Clinton was in 2016? Yes. But I don't think that Biden will win 232 electoral votes. I think he wins more. The question is, where does that come from? Well, I certainly don't think it's going to come from the state of Arizona. I think similar to Georgia and North Carolina, this is a state that Donald Trump only lost in 2020 by a margin of around 0.3% and won in 2016 by 4 points. This is a state that with any movement nationwide in favor of the Democratic column, despite you are seeing an influx of minority voters in this state, a growth in the Phoenix metro region, which is good for Democrats, but not enough to counteract the movement we've seen in the state, nationwide, and I think Arizona at this point in time does go to Donald Trump. And so what it tells you is that Donald Trump does win the election. I think he wins right now. This is the election today. I think the election could be very different come November. But this is where I'm, sort of settling in. I think in these final 2 states, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, this is really where we will see whether or not Joe Biden can really shine in these battleground states. On one hand, I think Wisconsin does go red. I think it'll be close. I think it'll be very close. I think it will be just as close as it was in 2016, if not closer. Biden won this state by 0.6, Trump won the state by 0.7, neither of which won by an overwhelmingly large margin, but it is to say, based on where we are nationally, it wouldn't make sense to have Arizona, Georgia red, and Wisconsin blue. Michigan, I think, is the real surprise here, but again, it's a state with a uniquely high Arab American population. You find that Dearborn really does drive a lot of the Democratic support across the country, across the state, and potentially by proxy the country, depending on how the election cycle goes. Michigan, though, right now, I think Donald Trump wins. Wisconsin, I think Donald Trump wins, but, this might be controversial, but I think Joe Biden actually does well in Pennsylvania. I think he wins the state by a very narrow margin. Having done a little bit more, investing my time into Pennsylvania and understanding it on a little bit more of a complex level, I think that Pennsylvania, especially given the recent numbers out of the state, given the recent election cycle, given the Supreme Court election last time, I think Pennsylvania is a state where while there may be a decrease in support amongst the Philadelphia region, you do find that these white voters in their, very minimal shifts do keep Joe Biden in power in this state. I think you're going to find, too, that given the fact that this is going to be a campaign not only ran by President Biden, but by the popular Governor Josh Shapiro, by a Senate race where you will see Democrats drive up turnout with a dynasty there for Bob Casey Jr., who's running for re-election in this race. You are going to find that the perfect storm is starting to build in this state, and Pennsylvania is the right one here for Democrats. And like I said about the numbers here, I don't believe entirely in polls, but they do provide a little bit more context into how the race is going, who's doing well, and what the status might be between now and Election Day. And I will say that of all of the swing states, Pennsylvania has shown the best news for Democrats quite far, and we have seen this as well consistently that Biden does do around 6 to 7 points better in Pennsylvania than he does in states like Michigan or Wisconsin, or in some cases even Georgia, Arizona, and North Carolina. So I'm very interested to see how Pennsylvania votes in the upcoming election cycle. I would say today, if I had to put money on it, Pennsylvania goes blue, Wisconsin and Michigan go red. I know that may be quite surprising, but it does show just really how close this election cycle is and how much of it is really boiling down to 7 to 8 core battleground states that will determine the future of this country and the future for both of these candidates. So final map here, 287 for Donald Trump. He wins the election today. Joe Biden at 251, but all of it well within flippable distance in favor of a Republican advantage, a Democratic advantage, but only time will tell. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.